Chapter 10, Day 5, Sphere 4, Ma'at. Ma'at, the Law of God. It is unfortunate that the Law of God has been popularized in the world today as a set of rules to be observed because they emanate from an authority. While it fits the model for man's law, it violates the spirit in which the divine law was framed by God and presented to man. The proper presentation of divine law is an exposition of the relationships, complementary, supplementary, interdependence, etc., that each thing in the world has with all others, and to the whole. The meaning of the word universe is one verse, and is thus not a legitimate synonym for the word world. The word universe, therefore, implies the existence of a unity underlying the things of the world, which on the surface presents to the non-understanding mind the semblance of pluriverse, a world in which each thing is a separate being existing in and for itself. This is the view that the theory of evolution presents to us. To understand the law of God, let's imagine that we are building a machine made up of 10 sets of parts, that each of these sets has 20 parts, and that each 10 sets are all interdependent on each other. The 20 parts in each set are also related to each other in a web of interdependence. That is, the function of each part synergizes the functions of the other 19 in such a manner that none of the parts can carry out its function if all of the others don't, i.e., one is because all are. We must realize that while the 20 parts in a given set are related to each other, they are not directly related to the 20 parts of the other sets, yet they are related indirectly, given the fact that the 10 sets are interdependent on each other. In other words, if one set fails because of the failure of one of its parts, then the other 9 sets, with their 180 parts, will also fail. This is what is meant by divine law. This is how it should have been presented. What must be done to preserve the order of things? X must be done because everything depends directly or indirectly on it, and it depends ultimately on everything. Let's look at a few examples from real life. Let's begin with the web of interdependence that supplies the world of living things with its building block, protein. All the 3 macronutrients, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, are composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, with the exception of proteins, which have nitrogen in addition. Although the atmosphere has a superabundance of nitrogen, 79%, it is so unavailable to life forms in this state that Lavoisier, who first explained the composition of air, called it azote, without life. It is ironic that it would later be found to be the essential element of protoplasm, the substantial basis of physical life forms. The difference was due to the fact that Lavoisier had a segregated view of nitrogen, and later science was able to see it in its relationship to other things. Before nitrogen can appear on our table in the form of beans or steaks, it has to be made available to plants. This is the job of a relatively tiny number of bacteria, blue-green algae, Rhizobium, Japonicum, etc., which fix nitrogen to make it assimilable to a small number of plants, beans, the ginkgo tree, the alder tree, etc., which besides helping these bacteria survive, supply proteins to the vegetarians of the animal kingdom, which in turn supply protein to the carnivores, which in turn, along with the vegetarians, make nitrogen available to the rest of the plants that are not serviced by the nitrogen-fixing bacteria through their excrement, urine, and carcasses. We must note that functions like these are the reasons for the existence of many animals, to move nutrients, especially nitrogen, and minerals around, making them available to other animals and plants who may have a higher role to play, pollination of bees, etc., in the cycling of key nutrients and life support functions. The cycle is completed by another set of bacteria that unfix nitrogen compounds to return these to the atmosphere. The same happens with fats and starches. Their main compounds, oxygen and carbon, are taken in from the atmosphere by plants. Plants breathe in carbon dioxide, which goes into the composition of starches and fats. These are eaten by animals who return it to the atmosphere in the form of the carbon dioxide expelled in the out-breath. Incidentally, in noting that the key nutrients of life forms come from the atmosphere, one has to wonder if the ancient Egyptians knew this, as they were the only ones to have ever explained the attributes of the mother goddess, the nurturing aspect of God, through the metaphor of the atmosphere. This is Nut, the celestial cow. All other cultures made the earth the metaphor for the mother goddess. What is most instructive in the examples given above is the fact that if we look at the creatures of the world in a non-holistic manner, we fail to understand their true purpose and the laws that govern their being. Understanding of divine law depends, then, on holistic thinking, which is the very antithesis of the way of thinking that has dominated the world for the past 2,000 years. That we should not wantonly destroy the creatures of the world must not be accepted because of a command from an authoritative source. We must obey it out of the understanding of the repercussions that will follow, domino-like, down the chain, ultimately ending in our own demise. The theory of evolution, a stumbling block to understanding divine law. In the evolutionary path of thinking, there is no connection between the alder tree, the ginkgo tree, the blue-green algae, the various beans, the various nitrogen-fixing and unfixing bacteria, and a host of animals whose mere reason for being is the lofty job of spreading nitrogen via dung, urine, and their carcass throughout the world. These are all members of separate evolving streams, who for the sake of the survival of their own species may even do in other members of their evolutionary family. Survival goes to the fittest, according to this heresy. Let me ask you, what would happen if the key creatures in the nitrogen cycle, the nitrogen-fixing bacteria, evolved beyond these functions, or became extinct? All life forms on Earth would cease to be. Could it be that the survival of this small group of bacteria has been ensured by a greater intelligence that realizes the dependence of the entire world upon them? In the same manner, the various creatures of the earth have been arranged in an evolutionary sequence, progressing from the most simple and primitive to the most complex. So can the cells of the human body, yet we do not explain their differences as an evolutionary phenomenon. Blood platelets are not considered to be the unevolved form of some more complex cell because they lack a nucleus. They, like all cells in the body, are as simple or as complex as they are in order to carry out the function for which they were made. It is a question of structure or form dictated by function. The same is the case with the various creatures of the world. In the same way that we understand the body as a unity due to the web of interdependence and mutual relationships that exist between the various types of cells, so must we understand the unity of the creatures of the earth through their sharing in the cycles of the life sphere. This might raise the question as to why the world does not collapse following the extinction of several species. Part of it is due to the redundancies built into the Earth system. We must give thanks for being in the hands of a great engineer. And another part is due to the fact that some species are intermediary entities. This can only be understood when we view the creatures of the world as representatives of functions in a closed system, as opposed to an aggregation of purposeless and random progressions. Take the early hominids, for example. If we consider the realization of the oneness with God, actualization of our divine attributes, as the blueprint for man, then we can understand that the early hominids, Australopithecus, Neanderthal, etc., are preparatory stages and not divine or natural experiments. Since an essential factor in the shaping of man's being is his or her lengthy period of learning, during which man is incapable of self-care, he or she had to pass through a stage in which the human attributes were combined with the instinctive faculties. The latter enabled man to survive without education while he or she developed the human and divine parts of being. Incidentally, we must understand that the genes of this instinctive kind of man are still with us, though this type of man disappeared just 35,000 years ago. It is the role of spiritual cultivation to eradicate it from our being. Ma'at and morality. Divine law has been ill presented to the world and has therefore been rejected by most people. The same has happened with morality. Morality cannot be understood as popularly presented, the principles of right or wrong conduct. What is right and what is wrong can only be established once again through a holistic approach that places in perspective the relationships between all things. Now that we have an understanding of this principle, it is easy to see the relationship between social stability and such behaviors as lying, stealing, cheating, killing, and so on. For example, killing is not absolutely wrong. The truth concerning it depends on the principle of relationship. It's okay if you kill as the only option for the purpose of self-defense. Once the basis of morality is understood as the relationship between behavior and social stability, then all forms of conduct can be correctly analyzed regarding their rightness or wrongness. For example, the current Western custom of allowing youngsters to curse in the presence of adults, and vice versa, adults cursing at or in the presence of youngsters, can be shown to weaken or destroy the respect and receptivity due to adults by the young. And since the young are dependent on the material support, experience, and guidance of the elders, and the latter are dependent on the youthful vigor of the former, the cursing behavior, by destabilizing society, must be judged to be immoral. In the same manner, we can enter a judgment of immorality for such acts as the introduction into the biosphere of a quantity of nitrogen compounds, chemical fertilizers, explosives, etc., beyond the capacity of nature to recycle them back into the atmosphere when the negative effects are well understood. Increased acidification of the soil, rivers, lakes, rain, which lead to deleterious effects on the health of many other species, incompetence of the eggs of eagles, etc. By destabilizing nature, man's social order is, therefore, threatened. We can, unfortunately, find thousands more examples of such acts. This is how the concept of morality must be defined. To teach that things are wrong simply because they break God's law and that wrongdoers will be punished, instead of explaining the relationship between the act and the stability of nature and the social order, is to invite being ravaged by the millions of people who do not believe in God or have an ineffective belief in God. This is why today's world is in such trouble. The correct presentation is to show that the law of God is based on the interrelationships between things. Ecological concerns must be seen, first and foremost, as religious concerns. Ma'at and truth. Like morality, truth has also been incorrectly portrayed to the world. Part of the problem is due to the question classically formatted as, what is truth? Although an answer can be given to the question presented in this manner, and I will later give it, the subject is best understood if it is formatted as, what is the truth concerning X? This is due to the fact that truth concerns itself with the proper function of the things, their purpose, and correct interaction with and use of things. Before going further, let's discard the use of the word as a synonym for honesty, expressing what is felt, which is a typical Western reduction of an abstract concept to the sensual level. The following three principles are the determinants of the truth concerning any given subject. Number 1, the principle of intra-relationship, or the relationship that exists within the thing itself. This is the relationship that exists between the structure or makeup or form of a thing with its function or purpose. We can shorten this to the form-function relationship. 2, the principle of interrelationship, or the mutual relationship that exists between a thing and the other members of the whole, system, or unit to which it belongs. 3, the relationship between the thing and the whole to which it belongs, i.e. the function that the thing performs for the system or unit to which it belongs. These are the three principles that define the truth concerning everything or every event. To know truth, we must look at the relationships underlying a thing. We can illustrate these as follows. The form, function, intra-relationship as determinant of truth. We can say that the makeup of ducks' form shows that they were made to function in water. Unlike non-aquatic birds, their feathers, form, repel water. Their feet are paddles, and most of them can hold their breath underwater for a significant length of time. The interrelationship between members of a system and between each part and the whole. Earlier we saw the role played by different creatures in the cycle of nitrogen, which provides protein for the world, and the cycle of carbon dioxide, which provides carbohydrates and fat for the world. A small group of bacteria makes nitrogen available to a small group of plants and trees, representing perhaps less than 5% of the plant kingdom, the prime supplier of oxygen, in a usable form to the animal kingdom, carbohydrates, fats. Since the plants that are involved in the front line of protein generation through their symbiotic relationship with the nitrogen-fixing bacteria represent a small group, there has to be a means of spreading this nitrogen to the remainder of the plant kingdom. This is carried out through the creation of animals who eat these frontline nitrogen processing plants and spread the nitrogen around through their waste and carcasses. In this manner, other plants with other functions and the animals that depend on them, pollinators, etc., can now be brought into being and sustained. Because of the high level of energy in the plant kingdom and in animals that feed upon them, other animals must be brought into being to check their growth and expansion. Thus, we have plant expansion checked by vegetarian animals, and the latter checked by carnivorous animals. The carnivores are checked through their own form-function interrelationship. Their reduced energy capacity lowers their fertility and overall survival abilities. To illustrate further, let's note that green plants manufacture their food directly from sunlight. The diet of vegetarians, which derives most of its calories from complex carbohydrates, require much less expenditure of energy than a carnivorous diet. This is due to the fact that carbohydrates are less complex chemically than protein and fats, therefore involving less steps in their metabolism. In addition, less energy has to be expended fighting off bacteria, which is introduced at a higher level in a meat diet. Carnivorous creatures eat the vegetarian and other carnivorous animals and must expend more calories to get their energy from proteins and fats. This extra expenditure of calories for fuel translates itself into a reduction in the capacities to survive and perform in the world. We see this in the fact that the vegetable kingdom is the most prolific in regard to reproduction, includes the longest lived creatures, and the most resistant to harsh weather conditions and disease. It is followed in this respect by vegetarians and last by carnivores. Once we learn to look at the world as a gigantic network of interdependent systems, we can understand the function and purpose, truth of every creature, including man. This is the proper understanding of the law of God as formulated in Ma'at. Ma'at, truth, logic, and science. To fully understand the importance of truth, we must place it in its functional context. It concerns the validation of a premise that is operated on in logical thinking, i.e., Ma'at is the system of thinking through which the truth or falsehood of a premise used in reasoning is determined. We all know that in reasoning, there is nothing that can determine the truth or falsehood of the premise. This is the reason behind the well-known phrase, logical but not necessarily true. One must be amazed by the fact that Western scholars, in spite of knowing this, have exalted reasoning and the scientific method which depends on it as the highest expression of the human mind, and it cannot determine the truth of a premise. Note that on the tree of life it rates 8th, sphere 8, 0 being the highest, while the intuition that transcends thinking is rated 2nd, Tehuti, the principle of wisdom. Having abandoned all hope of finding a system of thinking that would certify a premise as true or false, Western scholars settled on the expedience of assuming that the premise was true and went on their merry rationalizing way. As would be expected, it gave rise to the tyranny of opinions, logical thinking based on premises arbitrarily assumed to be true, and eventually to the discarding of reasoning altogether for the expediency of submitting differences to be settled by the voting system, in spite of the fact that 35,000 years of Homo sapien experience has never shown that a position is true, better, or right, because a majority prefers it. To show the working of truth in logical processing, let's examine a well-known syllogistic formula. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. A, Socrates, is man. A is equal to B. Men are mortal. Then A is equal to C. Socrates is mortal. This conclusion about the specific entity, Socrates, his mortality, from the general observation, mortality of men, deduction, is based on the assumption that the physical entities known as Socrates and other humans represent the category man. While the above logical deduction is true for the physical entities, humans, sphere 10, it is not true for the entity man, sphere 0 to 10, which is the basis of the premise. Acceptance of the above reasoning without examining the premise will carry over to the belief in the mortality of our true self, man. It is one of the many logical arguments that militate against mankind's understanding of the spiritual teachings that attempt to guide man to his or her true self. This problem is the point of departure of one of India's greatest spiritual and literary masterpieces, the Bhagavad-Gita. The story opens with the hero, Arjuna, prepared to battle against an enemy representing the forces that threaten the order of the world. As he advances on the battlefield, he recognizes the enemies as his uncles, cousins, and other dear friends, which causes him to back out from the battle, complaining that he cannot kill his kin and friends. At this point enters the dispenser of wisdom, Lord Krishna, who admonishes Arjuna that the physical entities that he would kill in battle are not the real men, but their earthly vehicles. In fact, that he would liberate the men from the corrupted vehicles that have doomed their souls. As this instruction is beyond Arjuna's capacity to understand, let alone implement, Lord Krishna proceeds to uplift his understanding by giving him instructions in yoga, which instructions is the subject of the book. There are many other beliefs used as premises in logical thinking that suffer from similar flaws and lead to the reinforcement of ideas that interfere with people's ability to understand themselves and life. Man is a rational animal, equates the entirety of man, 11 faculties, or takes as man's essence his or her rational faculty, sphere 8, modified by and modifying the animal faculty, sphere 10. Worse than that, the premise, as the previous one, is an example of logic which has been admitted by everyone to be incapable of determining truth, yet it is used to establish the premise that will be assumed to be true. Premises based on the observation that man can reason and that the human is mortal are established through the process, although not shown in the logical procedure, of induction, generalizations from observed specifics. If the logicians instead followed the Ma'at system of thought, whereby the proposition to be used as a premise was examined according to the laws of intra-relationship and inter-relationships, then a true premise regarding man would be the result, i.e., we must look at man's function in the world, framed by his or her interrelationship with God, the environment, and other creatures, which determines his or her makeup, form, function, relationship, in order to arrive at the proper proposition to be used as a premise in all logical thinking regarding man. All subjects must be approached in this manner. It is thus the only way that the hydra of logical reasoning is to be defeated. Scientists exclude technicians, most chemists, mathematicians, doctors, etc., who are mistaken for them, will recognize in the definition of divine law the fundamental principle underlying the laws of science. It is the goal of science to discover the underlying web of relationships that operate in nature. What is of utmost importance here is the fact that the ancient Egyptians have been able to give the world an understanding of divine law, ma'at, in such a manner that it can be understood as the same law operating in the natural sciences and the humanitarian sciences, government, economics, psychology, etc. In addition, it enables us to elevate to the level of science such disciplines as theology and philosophy. It is the gestalt that has eluded contemporary Western scholars to date. If they would only look back to the past and outside of their milieu. The interdependence between God and man. Earlier in this chapter, we saw that every creature must be seen as a function within a system that is responsible, along with other systems, with their creatures, for manifesting the phenomenon we call the world. Man, as a creature, albeit the highest, is no different. Man is not some super ape with license to kill, who came into being ultimately from some random throw of the genetic dice, or an event in a molecular crap game. Once you are in the habit of looking at the world as a web of interdependent systems, each made up in turn of interrelated and interdependent creatures, you will arrive at the only possible conclusion that there is a great intelligence behind the creation of the world. It is of great interest to note that the principles that Western man uses as evidence of man's intelligence is evident in an exceedingly superior degree in the underlying structure of the world. Yet the existence of intelligence is denied as a principle underlying the shaping factors of the world. What arrogance! He cannot understand that there could be no science, no mathematics, had the world, the mind of man, and its operation not been conceived along these principles. Like all creatures in the world, man is a mere tool of God. God created the world in order to have experience, given the fact that in the state of being before creation, God is alone, one without a second. In this state of undifferentiation and inactivity, God is not even manifesting thoughts. In the book of knowing the transformations of Ra and the overthrowing of Apep, the Creator states, I was alone, and I, even I, came into being in the form of things which came into being, and I came in the forms of the Creator. This passage from the major Kamitic cosmological scripture makes clear the relationship between God's original aloneness and its coming into being in the form of things which came into being, quote unquote, and in the forms of the Creator, quote unquote. From this it is to be understood that all things in the world are expressions of God, even though they cannot all express the essence and fullness of God. The forms of the Creator are the metaphysical entities through which the world is created and administered, so-called angels, etc., and man, which, when spiritually perfected, is the one being created for the purpose of allowing God to express its essence and fullness as a living entity in the world. This was the purpose of making man in the likeness of God, by which was meant that in man was deposited the triune essence of God, the divine consciousness, Asar, will, Tahuti, and spiritual power, Seker. Through the men and women who have achieved spiritual perfection, realized all 11 laws of the Spirit, God enters the world to fully experience it as a living being and to promote, through face-to-face instruction, its divine plan to mankind. Such visitations, kept secret for the most part, comes like a thief in the night, has been recorded in the traditions of the avatars, bodhisattvas, and sages who have, from time to time, moved mankind along the path of spiritual development. They have come, and will continue to come through those few who take seriously, above all else, the work of spiritual development. Thus, look not to the Savior without, though honor her or him when he or she comes, but look foremost within. How will you know if you have attained spiritual perfection? Ask not, say not. You will know from the nourishment that the fruits from your tree of life gives to others. It is thus that the symbiosis between God and man is unfolded. Man must perfect his or her spirit to provide God with a fitting vehicle through which to come into the world, and in turn that person will benefit from the powers of God manifesting through his or her spirit. This is the highest and most sublime expression of the law of interdependence. Living ma'at, love, sharing, and wealth. When it is said that ma'at is a system of thinking for determining truth, it must not be believed that the law of God can be fulfilled by merely thinking. To know truth, ma'at, you must live it, is a Kamitic axiom expressing the chief requirement for the realization of ma'at. It was said that the highest expression of interdependence is to be seen in the relationship between God and man. As the world was created by God for the sake of its own experience, then man's worshiping of God must include the observance of the interrelationships between men and between man and the environment and all creatures. Of greatest importance is the service that men must give to each other. Within the understanding of ma'at, such service must be given seeking nothing in return, as what one gives to another one has done for oneself, in light of the fact that all things are interrelated. This cannot be overemphasized, as the majority of people on the spiritual path, quote unquote, tend to place greater stress on the performance of spiritual exercises, quote unquote, meditation, yoga, etc., than in rendering service to their community. The association of ma'at with sharing was symbolized through a group of deities of the sixth art of the Duat who gave alms to those on earth. They are called the Alt Ma'utiu, Ma'atiu, Kerumat. To give seeking nothing in return is the true definition of love. If everyone hearkened to this understanding of love, then no one would be in want, and this is true, the true expression of wealth. Ma'at's relationship to wealth was metaphorized in a Kamitic tradition by associating with her the green papyrus scepter. The papyrus signifies the book of the law, and the color green signifies prosperity and plenty. Ma'at and success. As with Tahuti, her male counterpart, Ma'at is associated with the planet Jupiter, which is the astrological significator of major or grand success. This success is the inevitable interplay of interrelated factors. In the sphere of human society, Ma'at's doctrine reveals that success is guaranteed to all members of society and to the society as a whole if the legitimate need and function of each member is met and allowed to play its part. Unfortunately, the perception of one's needs and options for action in the world within the framework of the law of interrelationships is seen by the immature as a limiting factor because of the restraints imposed by laws. Although the elements within a system of interrelated functions have a restraining effect upon each other, their collaboration leads to the successful completion of the group objective more surely than individuated efforts and goals. As concerns the success of individual efforts, Ma'at indicates that if the intrinsic shaping factors of the objective functional parts of the system are identified and made to work together, success must follow. With the sureness that characterizes so-called magical or miraculous acts. This reality has been obliterated from the understanding of people by the popular belief that God, like a doting father, directly fulfills the needs of people. No! God guarantees man's success by creating a world in which all events are controlled by the law of interrelationships and interdependence, divine law. In the book of knowing the transformations of Ra and of overthrowing Apep, before anything had been created, the Supreme Being states, "Not found I a place I could stand therein. With wisdom I enlightened my will. I laid a foundation in the divine law, Ma'ah, and through it I made every attribute." Quotes unquote. People are guaranteed success in all of their endeavors by simply observing the law of God. Ma'at, judgment and the proof of truth. A major theme in the doctrine of Ma'at centers around the rendering of judgment. Because Egyptologists have approached Kamitic spirituality in the mode of concrete thinking, they took what was a grand and far-reaching metaphor as the thing itself. This is the well-known scene of the weighing of the heart, will, or the psychostasia. It is true that it corresponds to the judgment of man following death of the initiate at the final trial for qualifying for spiritual power, wherein is conferred the scepter of flint hidden in the furrows of the goddess' brow, Ajna chakra, or so-called third eye. And at the crossroads we all face several times in our lives, but it is also a symbol of the equilibrium that must exist between all functions within the system. Ma'at, truth, is the demand for equilibrium between governed and governors, adults and youngsters, liberty and law, inner and outer cultivation, and so on. In the scene of the weighing of the heart, will, the proof of living truth is seen in decisions, actions of the will/heart, based on the law of God as opposed to one's likes and dislikes, fears, opinions, etc. Here, the law of God is symbolized by the feather, as a will that is based on the law of God will have nothing to weigh it down, that it will regret, be guilty of, etc. i.e., it will be light as a feather. But as noted, this scene is not limited to the psychostasia. It is a metaphor for the grand law of equilibrium that establishes the harmony between the activities of the interrelated parts of a whole. Thus, to be justified in truth, ma'akeru, is just not a matter of living morally, but of being in total equilibrium with the law of God. For example, one must observe the physical laws governing health, not only because physical equilibrium is necessary for the empowerment of the will, but because violation of the laws of health betray a lack of understanding or disregard for the interrelated factors governing health and the relationship between health and spiritual performance. Ma'at, the law of God versus the law of man. From the information given above, it should be easy to see that unlike God's law, many man-made laws are not expressions of the interrelationships between things. In fact, many of them are outright violations of divine law. This is a major cause of the strife that exists in all nations, from the endless bickering and electioneering to civil and internal wars. In other words, as long as framers of the laws of a country do so to benefit the interests of a few and powerful, there will always be justified social unrest. Of course, they will be labeled terrorists, anarchists, secessionists, and so on. From all of this, we can arrive at the most logical conclusion that social harmony, peace, and prosperity from the parochial to the international level can only be achieved by basing the law of man on the law of God, ma'at. It must be understood, however, that it is not just an act of identifying the relationships between the shaping factors of social life and packaging it as a constitution, for such a system cannot be fulfilled by mankind in its present state. There will have to be the institutionalization on a national or international scale of a system of spiritual development for mankind. Assignments. The night preceding day 5 of TOLM, Ma'at Contemplative Meditation. 1. Review the material given in this chapter, as well as the preceding sections wherein Ma'at was discussed. Additional data should be looked up through the index. 2. Go into trance using the instructions given in Chapter 5. You may also have a TOLM partner assist you with trance induction through Ari Sa'ang. 3. Once you are in trance, see signs of trance in Chapter 5. Recall to mind, i.e., contemplate, situations in which you violate the laws of Ma'at, of the Ma'at part of your spirit. Write down these situations as detailed scenarios. Take note of when, where, and with whom, what is said and done in the situation. You will use this scenario in your work in the days ahead. If you are not able to maintain yourself in trance as you perform this introspection, continue with the deep breathing throughout the contemplation. 4. The following questions will also assist you in your introspection. Ma'at questionnaire. It is of utmost importance to note that the answers to these questions are to be sought in what your behavior shows, and not what you say, know, or believe about the subject. I.e., the question concerns your ability to do, and not just your knowledge of the subject. 1. Have you mastered a holistic system of thinking? For example, the Tree of Life, the Tao Te Ching, the Dogon cosmology, etc. If your answer is yes, you have 50 points. 2. Are you able to give your love in every situation that is required, that is able to give seeking nothing in return out of a sense of oneness, not sentiment, to whomever, strangers even, is in need? If your answer is yes, you have 40 points. 3. Do you interact with all things in your life in harmony with the law of interrelationship, e.g., the form-function relationship and interdependencies that defines diet, sexual activities, social relationships, etc.? If your answer is yes, you have 20 points. Day 5 of TOLM, Ma'at Assignment. From this day on, you must make the effort to observe the laws of Ma'at in regards to the areas of your life you are now seeking to rectify, and to whatever area the insight spills over. As this is the very beginning of the process, and there are many other sets of violations, 9 more to be exact, do not be concerned over the fact that you may not be succeeding in your efforts. Of chief importance is giving respect to the presence of God in your spirit by resisting acting from emotional and sensual influences. Review your Amen, Auser, and Tahuti scenarios and make the effort to continue observing them.